Every farmer fought the frost with heaters. He buried his seedlings and lost nothing. The frost warning came on a Wednesday. May 11, 1987. The National Weather Service out of Missoula posted it just after noon. Temperatures expected to drop below 28 degrees by midnight, possibly lower by Thursday morning. Duration: 3 consecutive nights. In Ravalli County, Montana, that meant trouble. The Bitterroot Valley had been warm that spring. Warm enough that most farmers had already moved their transplants out of the greenhouses and into the ground. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, weeks of careful greenhouse work, all of it sitting in the open soil now, exposed. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, the valley smelled of diesel and panic. Roy Kester heard about it at the feed store on Highway 93, south of Hamilton. He was 64 years old, had been farming the same 210 acres in Ravalli County since 1956, 31 years on the same piece of ground his father had broken before him. He bought a 50-pound bag of blood meal, paid $6.40 for it, spoke to no one about the forecast, and drove the 7 miles back to his property without stopping anywhere else. He didn't stop to rent heaters, didn't call the propane supplier. He went directly to his back field and got his flat blade hoe. Roy's transplants were 38 days old. He'd started them from seed in the first week of April, 1,800 seedlings total, split between Roma tomatoes and California Wonder peppers. The Romas had gone in at 26-inch spacing, the peppers at 18. He'd put them in the ground on May 3rd, after the soil temperature at 4 inches had held steady at 54 degrees for 6 consecutive mornings. He'd been measuring it each morning with the same dial thermometer since 1968, pushing the probe down to 4 inches and reading it before breakfast. 8 weeks of work were in those plants, counting the greenhouse time. The Romas were standing 7 inches. The peppers 6. They had another 5 months ahead of them if the frost didn't come. Roy had seen a May frost take a full field in 1971. Seen it again in 1979. He knew what a propane heater cost per night, and he knew what it prevented and what it didn't, especially when the wind picked up and the temperature kept dropping past what the heater could compensate for. He had a different approach. He'd learned it from his father, Earl Kester, who had farmed the same ground from 1931 to 1959. Earl had learned it from a neighbor who came from Norway in 1911, a man named Halvor Torgrimsen, who grew vegetables on the Lofoten Islands, where late spring frosts were a regular feature of the season, and propane was not. Torgrimsen had learned it from his own father. The origin beyond that was not traceable. What Roy had was an unbroken chain of practical knowledge, past fence line to fence line, from a Norwegian island to a Montana valley over 3 generations. None of it was written anywhere the County Extension Service would have found it. He started mounding soil at 4:30 that afternoon. The technique was simple to describe and slow to execute. Roy moved down each row with his hoe, drawing loose soil from between the rows up around each seedling, covering the plant to within a ½ inch of its growing tip. Not packed soil. He was careful about that. Loose, crumbled earth, the kind that came apart if you pressed it, piled gently around each plant until the mound stood 3-5 inches from the base. Deep enough to insulate, light enough to brush aside without damage when the cold was over. The science behind it was something Roy had worked out through observation, not reading. Soil is not air. It absorbs heat through the day and releases it slowly through the night. The earth at depth does not follow air temperature the way exposed surfaces do. On a night when air temperature at ground level drops to 22 degrees, the soil 3 inches down holds close to 38. Not because of any applied heat, because of mass and stored warmth and the simple physics of how Earth holds what it's gathered from the sun. A seedling covered by 3.5 inches of loose soil experiences 38 degrees. An uncovered seedling experiences 22. Roy had watched this work 4 times in 31 years. He hadn't read it in an extension bulletin, hadn't had it confirmed by anyone with credentials. He'd watched the covered plants survive and the uncovered ones die, and that was the only verification he'd required. He worked row by row, 31 rows total, 1,900 mounds of soil. The first row took 24 minutes. He picked up speed through rows 2 and 3. By row 5, he had a rhythm: hoe, draw, shape, move. The headlamp clipped to his cap came on around 8 o'clock, when the light was going. His hands were cold by then. He kept working. He finished at 10:15 that night. 6 hours. He walked back to the house, set the hoe against the porch rail, and went inside. The thermometer on the porch railing read 34 degrees and still dropping. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to the silence outside. 3 miles north, on Willowbrook Road, Pete Waldorf was positioning his last propane heater. He owned 2 and had rented 4 more from Sorensen Equipment in Hamilton at $45 per heater per week. The propane supplier had delivered 180 gallons that afternoon, $162 for the load, cash transaction. Pete had positioned the 6 heaters around his transplant beds, spacing them every 25 feet, running them off a single line from the main tank. His transplants covered 80 linear rows. 6 heaters, spaced 25 feet, did not cover 80 rows evenly. There were gaps. Pete had been farming since 1949. 38 years. He knew frost. His answer was always heat, direct application, keep the air above 32 degrees, standard practice. He checked the heater settings at 9 p.m., adjusted one running low, and went inside. At the Pritchett farm, 4 miles south of Hamilton, Dale Pritchett had spent the previous 2 afternoons installing electric heating cable through his transplant beds. 400 feet of it, woven between the rows, staked at the corners. He plugged it in at dusk and watched the amp draw on the meter. The cable covered the interior of each bed well. The plants within 8 inches of the cable would be protected. The plants at the bed edges, the full 12 to 14 inches from the nearest cable run, would see whatever temperature the air brought. Reuben and Marcy Scholes, who ran a 60-acre operation along the valley floor west of Corvallis, had strung frost cloth over their rows. White row cover. The 1 5-ounce weight, stapled to wire hoops they'd bent themselves from fencing wire. 40 hoops per bed. 8 beds. 320 hoops total. The cover was pinned at the edges with 16-inch wire stakes, doubled at the corners. The wind was already picking up from the north when they finished, 8 miles per hour, according to the radio. Marcy went back out after dinner and added more corner stakes. The Larimer brothers, who ran the operation on Route 9 east of the river, had moved their remaining transplants back into the greenhouse. All 600 of them, by hand, through 4 hours of work, loaded onto flats and carried 70 yards across the gravel. The greenhouse would run its heating overnight, set to hold 45 degrees. The propane cost for 3 nights would run about $90. The 8 hours of manual labor each direction was not calculated. By 10 o'clock on May 11th, the valley had answered the warning the way it always had, with money and effort and equipment. With everything available to them. Roy Kester's field was a quiet row of soil mounds in the dark. The temperature dropped to 29 degrees by midnight. By 3 a.m. On May 12th, it was 24 degrees. By 5 a.m., just before first light, Pete Waldorf's thermometer at field level read 21 degrees. 2 of his heaters had exhausted their propane share of the line by 4 a.m. The sections around those 2 heaters dropped to 25 degrees before Pete noticed at 4:15. He was up, refilling from the reserve tank. By the time the heaters were running again, those sections had held at 25 for 47 minutes. He walked the rows at 7 a.m. in gray light. He could see the frost burn already, that papery, collapsed look that starts at the leaf edges and works inward, the tissue gone translucent where the ice crystals had formed and broken the cells. He counted the affected plants in the first section. Stopped at 90. Roy Kester was in his kitchen at 7 a.m. with a second cup of coffee. His field was soil mounds, nothing moving, nothing visible. He'd checked the outdoor thermometer at 6:30. It read 19 degrees. He poured a second cup and waited. Gerald Rast arrived at Roy's property just before noon on May 12th. He was the Ravalli County Extension Agent, had held the position since 1981. He drove a Greene County pickup and wore a canvas field jacket with a Montana State University patch on the sleeve. He pulled to the shoulder of the road at the edge of Roy's property and stood at the fence for a while, looking at the mounded rows. He walked up the drive uninvited. Told Roy that covering transplants with soil deprived them of light. Said warm season crops stressed by 3 days of darkness would emerge etiolated, pale, weakened, stretched. Saeed, the method would cause as much damage as the frost. He left a printed extension bulletin on frost protection for warm season vegetable transplants. The bulletin listed propane heaters, frost cloth, overhead irrigation, and greenhouse recall as the recognized methods. Soil mounding was not mentioned. Roy thanked him, took the bulletin, put it on the seat of his truck. The plants stayed covered. The second night was the coldest, May 12th into May 13th. Temperature at field level in the Bitterroot Valley dropped to 19 degrees by 2 a.m. Wind came up from the north at 12 miles per hour. Wind chill brought the effective temperature at ground level to 11 degrees. Pete Waldorf ran out of propane at 1:30 a.m. The 180-gallon delivery was gone. He called the supplier at 1:45. No answer. He spent the next 4 hours dragging his 2 remaining functioning heaters between sections of the field by hand, moving them every 90 minutes, trying to cover the most critical ground. Each move took 20 minutes. Each section got heat for 70 minutes before he moved on. Half of Pete's field received no heat at all between 1:30 and 5:30 a.m. At the Schultz farm, the frost cloth had partially blown free by midnight. Marcy found it in the morning, folded against the east fence line. 2/3 of one bed had been uncovered since before 1 a.m. The extra corner stakes hadn't held. Dale Pritchett's heating cable held temperature in the interior of the beds. The plants within 8 inches of the cable survived. The plants at the edges, 12 to 14 inches from the nearest cable run, where the heat gradient fell off, showed damage by morning. The Larimer brothers' greenhouse held. Their transplants were fine. They would need to reverse the 4-hour move when conditions cleared. Under Roy Kester's soil, the seedlings waited in darkness. At 3.5 inches of depth, the temperature through both nights had not dropped below 36 degrees. Roy measured it afterward with the same dial probe he'd been using for 19 years, pushing it to 5 inches at 3 separate points across the field on the morning of May 13th. The readings came back at 36, 37, and 38 degrees. The air temperature directly above those same points, 23 degrees. He left the plants covered through May 13th. The forecast called for a third night of frost, lighter, 28 degrees, clearing by morning. He checked the soil probe again at 4 p.m. readings held at 38 degrees. At 9 p.m. On the 13th, he mounded an additional 2 inches of soil along the windward side of each row, the north face, where the wind had been pulling surface heat away through the previous nights. That work took 90 minutes. He was finished by 10:30. The third night was shorter. Temperature dropped to 27 degrees by 3 a.m. and began rising by 5 a.m. By 9 o'clock on May 14th, the valley was at 41 degrees and climbing. Sun on the mountains, ice gone from the truck windshields. Roy started uncovering plants at 9:45 a.m. He used his hands for most of it, brushing the loose soil away from the growing tip first, working down the stem carefully, exposing the plant to light in a single slow motion. He moved at roughly 60 plants per hour. At 11 a.m., Pete Waldorf's truck stopped along the road in front of Roy's property. Pete sat in the cab for a moment, got out, walked to the fence. He didn't say anything. Roy was in the third row, working north, and didn't look up immediately. When he did, Pete was still at the fence. Neither of them said much. Pete eventually got back in the truck and drove on. Roy finished uncovering at 6:15 p.m. 14 hours of total labor over 3 days, counting the initial mounding and the second night reinforcement. He walked the rows in the last light. The plants were pale. That was expected. 3 days without photosynthesis. The chlorophyll diminished. The leaves were a lighter green, almost yellow-white in places. Soft. The Roma stems in particular looked drawn. But the stems were upright. Roots intact. The growing tips were intact. No frost damage on a single plant. 1,800 seedlings. None lost. He walked back inside, set the probe on the kitchen counter, wrote the soil temperature readings in the spiral notebook. Date, depth, readings at 3 points, air temperature above. The notebook had been running since 1967. This was its 40th frost entry. 3 days after uncovering, the pale color was mostly gone. The plants had resumed pulling light. By May 21st, 7 days after uncovering, the Romas were showing new growth at the tips. The peppers had returned to their full, deep, waxy grain. By May 25th, walking the rows, Roy could not identify which plants had spent 3 days under soil. They had all continued growing as if May 11th through 14th had not happened. He checked the growth measurements he'd recorded on May 10th, the day before the warning. Average Roma height, 7.1 inches. He measured again on May 25th, 10.6 inches. That was 3.5 inches of growth in 15 days, accounting for 3 days of no-growth dormancy under soil. On his rate calculations from previous years, that was within normal range. Pete Waldorf's field was a different thing to walk. He'd lost 683 plants out of 1,500. 46%. The dead were in 2 clusters, the sections where the heaters had run empty through the coldest hours of the second night. The plants nearest the functioning heaters had survived. The plants farthest away had not. The pattern was visible from the road, 2 brown patches in an otherwise recovering green field. Pete spent $380 on propane across 3 nights, the 180-gallon delivery plus 2 emergency fills at after-hours rates. Replacement transplants from a Missoula nursery cost him $340 for 400 plants, which was all the nursery had left after every farmer in the valley called the same week. He direct seeded the remaining 283 spots, which would come in 3 weeks later than the transplanted sections. The timing cost him on price at the Hamilton Farmers Market in September. Early tomatoes moved at $1.80 per pound, late ones at $1.20. Total direct cost, $720 plus lost margin on the late harvest rows. Dale Pritchett lost 31% of his transplants. The cable had cost $210 to install and would require removal and reinstallation each year. 2 days of labor annually. Both directions. The Schultz farm lost 55% of 1 bed. Reuben calculated the replacement cost and yield gap at $1,400 for that bed alone. The frost cloth was a total loss after the wind had it. 2/3 of the hoops were bent beyond reuse. The Larimer brothers lost nothing, spent $90 in greenhouse propane and 16 man-hours in labor, 8 hours moving plants in and 8 moving them back out. Roy Kester spent 14 hours moving soil with his hands and a hoe. No propane. No rented equipment. No replacement plants. Gerald Rast drove back past Roy's property on May 20th. He slowed near the fence line. Roy's rows were upright and green, new growth showing at the tips. The pale episode already passed. Rast sat in his county truck for a moment. Looking, he drove on. He didn't come back that season. In April of 1988, he released his annual advisory on frost protection for Ravalli County transplant growers. It listed propane heaters, frost cloth, overhead irrigation, cold frames, and greenhouse recall as recognized methods. Soil mounding was not on the list. Roy received the advisory in the mail, read it, set it with the 1987 bulletin in the same folder in his filing cabinet. In the fall of 1987, 3 people from the valley came to Roy's property on separate days, at separate times. None of them had called ahead. One came returning a borrowed post-hole digger. One stopped while Roy was repairing the roadside fence. The third was a woman named Harriet Dunmore, who ran a 20-acre market operation off Sleeping Child Road and had lost 38% of her transplants in May. Harriet asked about the method directly. Roy demonstrated on a single remaining plant in the field, still in the ground in early fall, covered it with mounded soil to 3.5 inches, explained the temperature differential he'd measured with the probe, uncovered it. The whole demonstration took 4 minutes. She used the method in 1988. No late frost that year. She didn't need it. She used it again in 1991, when a frost on May 17th brought 26 degrees for 2 nights. She lost nothing. Her neighbors on Sleeping Child Road lost between 20 and 60% depending on how their heaters held. She called Roy after the 1991 frost cleared. Told him the result. He said that was about right. Roy kept a record of every significant growing season event in a spiral notebook he'd bought at the Hamilton Pharmacy in 1967. He'd filled 12 notebooks by 1987. The May 1987 frost occupied pages 211 through 219 of Notebook 12. Weather data, soil temperature readings at 3 depths, plant counts before and after, growth measurements at weekly intervals through June, final harvest comparison against the 1986 season. The 1987 season finished 4% below his 1986 total yield. He attributed that gap to the 11-day growth disruption from dormancy and uncovering, not to frost loss. He had no frost loss to account for. In 42 years of farming Ravalli County, Roy experienced 7 late frosts that arrived after transplanting. He used the soil mounding method each time. Frost events in 1971, 1974, 1983, 1987, 1993, and 2001. In all 7 events, he lost 0 transplants. He never used propane heaters, never purchased heating cable, never paid a frost season propane bill. He calculated, in a conversation with his daughter Sandra in 2006, that at average propane rates and equipment rental costs from 1971 through 2005, the method had saved him roughly $11,200. That number included only the direct costs of heat protection. It did not include replacement plants, late-season yield gaps, or labor for equipment installation and removal. Sandra wrote the figure on a piece of paper and taped it to the refrigerator. Roy told her the number was probably low. The method was not his invention. He had inherited it from his father, who inherited it from Halvor Torgrimsson, who had grown vegetables on rock and cold ground in the Lofoten Islands of Norway, where the growing season was short and every seedling was worth protecting, and no one had propane to burn. The technique had traveled with Torgrimsson in 1911 across the Atlantic and the continent, and landed in Ravalli County, Montana, where it sat for 76 years without appearing in any county advisory or university extension bulletin. What it required was soil, a hoe, patience, and the knowledge that ground holds heat longer than air does. All four of those things were free. By 2009, when Roy retired at 85, 5 farms in the Bitterroot Valley were using the method regularly. Not many. The valley had over 200 active operations. But 5 farmers who had seen the 1987 results, or the 1991 results, or the 2001 results, and had decided to learn it and keep it going. None of them had seen a university paper on it. None had attended a workshop. All of them had learned it at a fence line or on a phone call from someone who had seen it work. Sandra Kester took over primary farming operations in 2009, kept the transplant schedule, kept the soil mounding practice, ran the spiral notebook system in a new format. A green ledger book she started the year she took over. Same entries: soil temperature, air temperature, plant counts, growth measurements. The first late frost she faced alone came on May 9, 2012. Temperature dropped to 26 degrees for 2 nights. The valley ran heaters and frost cloth. Sandra mounded 1,200 rows of transplants the afternoon the warning came. 48 hours later, she uncovered them. None lost. She called Roy after. Told him. He didn't say much in response. He was 88 years old and had been hearing the same results since 1971. He knew what the ground held. Roy Kester died in February of 2019. He was 95. The Ravalli Republic ran an obituary that mentioned 53 years of farming in the Bitterroot Valley, his family, his membership at First Lutheran. It did not mention the method. The spiral notebooks from 1967 onward are in Sandra's house on the property. 12 of them, stacked on the shelf above the kitchen window that looks out over the back field. The same field where Roy stood in a headlamp at 10 o'clock on the night of May 11, 1987, and mounded the last of 1,800 small hills of soil, while his neighbors 3 miles north ran propane heaters that ran dry in the coldest hours before dawn. The field is still there. The soil is the same soil. In a cold spring, when the warning comes in from Missoula and the forecast says 3 nights below freezing, Sandra Kester gets her hoe and starts at the south end of the first row. The ground holds what it's gathered. It always has. Still works. Same as it always did.